I'm going to give you a little personal context behind this next panel, which is human trafficking, what we don't know but should know as Houstonians. There's a little bit of a story here that I think you may appreciate when you hear it, but our partners at the Greater Houston Community Foundation have been a part of this for the last several years, and we certainly value it. In fact, they're great partners of our firm. We power our firm foundation on their donor advised platform, and it's been a great relationship with us for a number of years. But as we worked with them, we talked about, okay, what could the Greater Houston Community Foundation does contribute to this? And they offered some thoughts and ideas about some things which were pretty impressive, nice, talented. And this little woman right here kind of spoke from the back of the room and said, I have an idea, but I don't know how you're going to react to it. And I said, well, if it's going to help me lose weight, I'm excited about it, but it didn't do that. But
sorry. That's next year.
That's next year, exactly. And I said, what is it? And she said, well, we do a lot of work in our city on the topic of human trafficking. And I said, well, that's eye-opening because I personally have participated for the last several years with Covenant House as part of their executive sleep out in November of every year. And it's a national outreach that all the major cities are represented. And I have to be honest, it was an eye-opening experience for me to do it. Not so much the sleeping out part, but the outreach part, that they took us out into our city. And our city at night in many places is very different than it is during the day. And I saw things that really concerned me in two ways. One, it concerned me as a city that these things exist to the degree they do in our city. And it concerned me as a Houstonian that I wasn't more informed. And I felt like I wasn't living up to my covenant as a Houstonian to be a better citizen, be a community member. And it was around this element of human trafficking. So when Rebecca brought it up, I said, you know what? I don't have a problem with taking a swing and missing. And I think part of what this forum is about is to raise awareness. I have found that Houstonians may not know everything, but once they know about something, they are more than willing to step in and say, how can I make a difference? And so the purpose of this is to really better inform us as Houstonians about some of the challenges that do exist in our city. They may not be a topic that we love talking about, but they're real. And maybe walking out of this, if one of you feels the need to step into the fray and make a difference, then this will all be worthwhile. And so that's the reason behind this choice. With that, Rebecca Hove, Senior Director of Strategic Philanthropy with the Greater Houston Community Foundation, is going to moderate this panel. She's been an anti-human trafficking advocate going back into the mid-90s, focusing on many areas of this, both domestically and internationally. And she has dual bachelor's degrees in Spanish and sociology from Duke, so another smart person up here. It's terrible what happened to your basketball player last week with the shoe blowout.
We can't go there.
Right, and I'm one of these other panelists, Kyle Wright, she'll introduce. Kyle and I have known each other for a number of years, and Mina as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca and step back and try to become better informed. Thank you.
Thank you, Del. Well, we are so grateful. Oh, is the mic a little too? Oh, okay. I'll try and keep my voice a little lower. We're so grateful to be here this morning. Thank you to PKF. Thank you, Del, for inviting Greater Houston community to come and share this story. And thank you, Bill, for all of your work organizing today, where I know how much work you all have put into pulling this off. And special thanks also to my colleague, Susan Zarek, that is back there working alongside of me at GCRFF and working alongside many of you all investment professionals and advisors in the room. So thank you for having us. We are excited to talk about kind of this concept, even as Del mentioned, shifting a paradigm out of the ordinary for types of topics that you all would typically have at a conference like this. And that's one way at Greater Houston Community Foundation that we are really thinking about our own work and impacting social change in the Houston community by doing creative, innovative things, shifting paradigms, and building cross-sectional collaborations that are aiming towards making strategic change in certain identified issues. And human trafficking happens to be one of the issues that the Community Foundation works on, all because of donor interest. So everything that we do at the Community Foundation is driven by our donors, many of whom are clients with your firms. And we really try and put into action whatever concept that donor wants to try and catalyze and the change that they want to see come about in the community. It could be on a specific topic within a certain issue area or a certain type of philanthropy. So today's panel is going to use human trafficking as that lens of looking through the shifting paradigm to how work with our donors and a group of donors at GHCF has really transformed things within the topic of human trafficking for our city, and we're hoping around the nation and around the world. So that's what we're going to try and explain today, how we are shifting cultural paradigms with this anti-trafficking work. So really quickly about GHCF, we are a nonprofit. We're a 501c3 public foundation, and as I mentioned, our trafficking group is just one of the ways that we collaborate with our donors. We have several types of community impact funds. We have other types of philanthropic vehicles such as field of interest funds. Of course, donor advised funds might be the ones that you all are most familiar with. We do outsource services to private foundations. So Kyle will share his story, but really when a donor comes to us, we have that listening conversation to hear what it is they want to try and accomplish, and do they have structures already set up to help them accomplish those aims, or between things that they might have within their family office structure or other advisors and philanthropic tools that we have at Greater Houston Community Foundation. We kind of put the puzzle together to figure out what a potential solution, and the solutions can evolve even, pulling together potential solutions to get at whatever their core issue is, and kicking off that transformative change. So as Del mentioned, I'm very grateful to have these two experts with me today who have also been my partners in this work. Kyle is a donor of GHCF and works for the Stardust Fund. I'll mention you all should look at their bios in your programs. I'm not going to go through all of their credentials, but we've been working with Kyle on this project in particular since late 2013. And then Minal Patel Davis is the special advisor to Mayor Turner on human trafficking. Minal started her post in the summer of 2015 and has been just going gangbusters, bringing around a municipal approach, which has been a paradigm shift in and of itself, to some strategic aims for targeting this issue. So please check out their bios, please check out their websites and learn more about what they're up to. But I'm grateful to have had you all as partners and friends over this 5-year journey. So with that, we'll kind of dive into the meat. Today, that's a little bit of the why, about why we're here. To focus on the what, as Del mentioned, he wanted us to pick stories that might inform you all about things related to human trafficking that you might not be aware of. So this topic has been getting a lot of buzz lately. You might have seen an article this past weekend about a Patriots owner and some activities that he was involved in. And things can get kind of tricky because even in that article, you hear prostitution, you hear illicit massage establishment, you hear trafficking. So we thought that a good way to start off a conversation about things we should know that we don't would be a tiny technical 101 on the true definition of what human trafficking is, so you can start to distinguish what it is from maybe some things that it's not, like not prostitution. Sometimes it's also confused with smuggling. Human trafficking is not the same as smuggling. But Minal, why don't you give us the official definition for human trafficking?
Sure. So basically, trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion for a commercial sex or labor act, unless you're under the age of 18 for a commercial sex act. And there, in that case, if you've ever heard the phrase, there's no such thing as a child prostitute, that's what that means. A child cannot consent to a sexual act. And so that's why the federal statute is sort of written that way. The other thing, like Rebecca mentioned, it's often confused with prostitution and the willingness of the folks that are in the commercial sex industry from their own free will. So if someone is willingly buying sex or selling sex, that's prostitution. There's no consent when there's someone who's a victim of trafficking. And you also mentioned the illicit massage industry. I'll talk about that a little bit because of what happened and the news that's hit in the last week. Is what you often have with trafficking is legitimate industries like massage establishments that we might all go to. But then there's this illicit layer, right? So they have an illicit form of that, and that's where there are some of these sexual acts that are being done. As far as wage theft on the labor side, I'll talk about that a little bit. So if you think about labor exploitation as a continuum, you have wage theft, which can be a component of trafficking. It's oftentimes, in a labor trafficking case where the person is not being paid their full wages. So it's definitely a component. But if you think about it as a continuum, it's sort of on the left side. So if I don't get paid by the city and I still go home every day to my husband and I have my own free will, I'm a victim of wage theft. But if the free will, the movement, and there's additional restrictions, it starts to move along that continuum, if you will. So on the far end of it, you have labor trafficking, where there's that use of force, fraud, or coercion, and wage theft. So these are some of the distinctions and some examples.
Great. And Kyle, why don't you give your perspective of Stardust's journey? Of the three of us, you're probably most similar to the same chair that folks in our audience are sitting in, having being part of a family office and becoming aware of this issue. Why don't you kind of share what your journey has been?
Sure. So I do come from the family office perspective, the privilege of overseeing the investment and philanthropic portfolio for Molly Gotchman. And our family office is called Stardust. On the philanthropic side, we are focused primarily on what we call socially excluded populations, those most vulnerable in our society, and economically. And so on that journey, really in 2011, Molly started to learn more about trafficking and how the scale is much larger than we really understood, but also started hearing kind of these heartbreaking survivor stories along in our philanthropic work. Most of the interest that she had at that time was really international, and so we started doing some grant making on the international side, supporting NGOs working on the ground in kind of the highest prevalent countries and hotspots, if you will, around this issue. And so we were able to get into the field, understand the issue by talking to experts in those places, meeting with migrants who had been trafficked from Myanmar to Thailand, for example, that just got off shrimp boats after a 3-month really being held in captivity to work on these boats with no pay, ranging to meeting women in Delhi who had been trafficked from Nepal into the sex trade. And so really this full range. When Molly in 2013 was working in Asia, I think it was Cambodia, someone mentioned to her, said, "It's great that you're here, really appreciate the resources, but aren't you from Houston? Isn't Houston a hub for human trafficking?" And she immediately called me, I think it was in the middle of the night, my time, and said, "We've got to start looking at home and start working on this at home." And so that's really where our journey started, from working on this issue in Houston in the United States.
And Rebecca, if I could clarify the smuggling trafficking, I know you mentioned that and I didn't mention that, but smuggling is a crime against a political border, and movement is a requirement of that because you're moving across that political border. And the way trafficking has been labeled, it's really a misnomer, right? Because you don't need to have movement. And the reason I remembered mentioning it is because Kyle mentioned the India-Nepal example, which of course it can be an aspect of trafficking, but you have examples in the United States of families trafficking their own children out of their own home without ever moving them across a border. So trafficking is an absolute crime without any consent. Smuggling, the person is a willing person wanting to move across that border.
One of our first stories, actually, when we came back to start looking at this issue domestically, was we met a survivor that was trafficked not far from here, actually, by her foster mom over and over again. And so she's doing fine now, and it's amazing how resilient survivors can be. But it was just right there in our face where, again, these systems like foster care, there are pipelines and exploitation all around us.
Thanks for providing both the international and the local examples. When you and Molly started to investigate things more locally, Minal, perhaps you could share some insights as to how human trafficking shows up in our city, what things we might look for. Again, thinking back to the journey that Kyle and Molly began on, just looking out into their community to see where they could make a difference.
Sure. I'll direct you all to Polaris's website. Just over the last year, Polaris is the national trafficking think tank for the United States, and they run the National Trafficking Tip Hotline. And so they get a lot of data because of that, because they're getting calls from all over the country. So they released the 25 typologies of trafficking report. I'll go over a few of them here. We already mentioned how it happens in illicit massage parlors. It can be familial, as we've mentioned. You can see it on the streets during prostitution. There are people that are actually forced to do that, although the appearance won't look that way. But on the labor side, you have commercial cleaning industries. You have small labor, if you will, where you can have a domestic servant that's been trafficked. And in fact, in the last 2 years, there was a case of a domestic servant with a Nigerian family in Katy or in Cinco Ranch that was sort of busted by the Homeland Security investigations. And she's, in the process of that prosecution and restitution and all of that. So you also have big labor where you have corporations that are convicted, that are sued both civilly and criminally. So for instance, after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, there's the Big Signal case, and that was a big labor case where 500 Indian nationals were moved in violation of visa laws to help with the rebuild effort. So us being in a post-Harvey context, that's something we from the mayor's office have worked proactively to mitigate against.
Excellent, thank you. So Kyle, you touched on this a little bit earlier, sharing that you run a family office. Why did you guys decide to engage on this topic, besides Molly's initial draw to the crisis? And as you've been along your journey and had conversations like this, what are other donors, other folks in the investment industry, other people that you all are working, collaborating with in the family office setting, what are they saying about this topic, and what things have you learned that they also didn't know?
Sure. Well, I think we launched. I joined Molly in 2007 to launch the family office. It was kind of a traditional framework around financial management and personal services. And when Molly started really kind of digging into the issue, and I think this is kind of an example of paradigm shifting around. For her, it was less about the office as being like that management entity, but more as a vehicle for impact. And I think you see that with kind of next generation leaders and families that are really looking to access and being engaged through all areas of their leverage and all tools at their disposal. And so we really started shifting around this issue specifically. We decided, okay, this is something we want to double down on. It became our issue because of understanding kind of the systems level, the gaps from kind of ecosystems and systems on the issue, but also in terms of the funding gaps that existed specifically in our community. And so when we started coming back to Texas and Houston, we're a pretty lean organization and really stand on the shoulders of other donors, others that are working on issues. We went to the Community Foundation, who we were partnering with on our philanthropy, and asked, could you provide a landscape of all the NGOs, the nonprofits working in this space in Houston, and also make introductions to the donors that are targeting in a very strategic way around this issue. And they came up with some great nonprofits that have been working for many years on this issue in our community, but the donor list came up blank. Most of the larger major donors understood at some level, at the program level associated about the issue and how it may be touched, but no one was really focusing on trafficking. And so understanding that we alone couldn't really tackle this issue and that we had to kind of build a collaborative effort here and learn alongside others, we asked the Community Foundation to host with us a donor education event where about 70 donors from our community came around and listened to a panel of experts. This was in 2014 around the issue. From there, I'd say about 24 or so donors, donors that you know, both individually and major foundations, all of the major foundations really wanted to continue the conversation. And so we met several months after that, and from there formed the Anti-Trafficking Donor Working Group that the Community Foundation hosts and administers. And very quickly, we realized this was more than just check writing or building capacity for nonprofits, that we have an opportunity to share expertise and networks and leverage at a more strategic level than any one nonprofit or organization or individual can do. And so we started asking, big questions, and really one of the biggest questions was, if Houston is known to be a hub for human trafficking, we're also known to be one of the most innovative philanthropic cities in the world, why can't we shift from this hub of trafficking to a solution center for trafficking? And so at that point, these donors committed to that framework. And I think maybe the first or second meeting, one of the major donors raised his hand and said, we can take some examples of community efforts that have been successful here, and homelessness is one of those, where there's been a private-public engagement on reducing homelessness, and it's actually very tied to trafficking. What does the public engagement look like in terms of who is owning and coordinating that effort? And so from there, we decided to pitch to Mayor Parker as a collective this idea of a special advisor to the mayor on trafficking, to really take this very seriously and coordinate efforts in our community, both from a direct service standpoint, but also from a systems level. Mayor Parker accepted that, and after several kind of months of back and forth, and thankfully, Minal was there to accept and take on this challenge. We supported, not by check writing, but supported kind of by leverage this position. So I think it's a great example of this kind of collective model of giving that you're seeing more of, where we're not pooling funds into a human trafficking fund, but we're coordinating, understanding who's in what lane, that you may be funding homelessness or education, and you can focus on education through a lens of trafficking and support groups that are doing prevention training in schools, or focus on homelessness, how to integrate screenings into the groups you're already supporting around trafficking. So really more about the strategic way of doing philanthropy through the lens of trafficking.
And as you mentioned, that was a real paradigm shift for philanthropy as well. We have our own industry buzzwords, one of which is public-private partnership, another is collaboration. But sometimes, as Kyle mentioned, we would dig into the data and start to peel the onion back and find that we were coming up a little empty with some of these buzzwords. So in designing the donor working group, we really did seek to truly have that cross-collaboration. So a true partner in the city. The city is putting up funding, and then private philanthropy is funding, as Kyle mentioned, problems or solutions they're seeing along that same stream or in an intersectionality stream, maybe with migrants and refugees or the homeless population group. But we really did want to try and bring in a multiple of social sectors. So Minal has mentioned working with the corporate sector, and we have corporate donors that are a part of this group, and providing that lens to keep it balanced, looking at labor trafficking, not just sex trafficking, because sometimes sex trafficking can get all of the media attention, and it's lesser known that folks maybe working in a lawn crew or in a neighborhood magazine crew could be subjected to a labor trafficking ring. We also work with a variety of community stakeholders. So when our group defined what we wanted the term donor to mean and donor partners for our group, we said, you know, we'll take anybody that wants to work with us in a strategic end game fashion. Yes, they can be bringing financial resources, but they might have political resources that they can bring to bear that's helpful for advocacy work. They might have media connections that can help us tell a story, and like a marketing and communications firm, pro bono, designed Minal and Mayor Turner's, through the mayor's office, their whole media campaign, talking and educating about trafficking. So we have folks in our group that are from institutional banks, and as Kyle mentioned, institutional foundations that have professionals running their program portfolios, as well as family foundation members. So again, we were really looking for anybody that was truly engaged and willing to kind of step out on some of these ledges to create innovative change in this arena. And with that, I did mention the marketing campaign, Minal, but what other types of things have you taken on at the city, at a municipal level? Because that in and of itself we found to be a paradigm change, that nobody was looking at this from a city systems perspective. As Kyle mentioned, our group is kind of looking at all of these different systems to find the tipping point. And I liked that grain of sand analogy. We're looking for that one grain of sand that will then shift the landscape in this area. So how has that happened with the work at the city?
Sure. So I'm still stuck on stepping out on a ledge because they mentioned Mayor Parker. I've been here for 3 years and 7 months. I joined in the last 6 months. I was appointed of Mayor Parker's term. So I had a whole transition to manage. That's why you kind of see me smiling. So in 3 years and 7 months, it's been 2 mayors, 3 chiefs of police, and 3 chiefs of staff, because we had interims and things like that. So that's why you saw me smiling. So the traditional paradigm that trafficking is combated with is a pure law enforcement paradigm, right? So if you think back now to all the media that you've seen, it's usually discussing law enforcement. And the reason for that is that the United Nations Palermo Protocol sets about a 3P paradigm. And the 3Ps are basically protection, prosecution, and prevention. And so all those roads lead to prosecution. And you have all these signatories to the UN Palermo Protocol, which then means at the national level of all of those countries, they have trafficking legislation that uses that paradigm, right? So the same for the United States. We have the TVPA, and that's the paradigm across the United States. At one point, there were about 42 task forces across the country that use that to prosecute traffickers, which is a much needed thing, of course. But then you have this municipal position, and our police department has long been involved in the trafficking response here in Houston since 2004. So what do you do as this new appointee it's the first of its kind position in the United States? There's no counterparts across the country. So there's 100 parks directors, right? There's 100 procurement officials, if not more, but there's no trafficking advisors. So we had this amazing opportunity because of the donor working group and the Greater Houston Community Foundation to start to think about what this looks like. So the first thing that we did is start a national landscape analysis and just see what was going on around the country. Then we did a local landscape analysis and saw, what exactly is happening locally and what are our nonprofits that are doing the hard work here saying that they need. Where are they running up against a wall that they can't sort of get through? So we took all of that information and took it against the strengths and weaknesses of the mayor's office. So the example I always like to use is if we said we want to end child trafficking, which we of course want to, none of the systems that would enable us to make an impact are under the purview of the mayor's office, right? So if you think about child protective services, if you think about DFPS, that's all under the purview of the governor's office. And he does have a child sex trafficking team. That person was appointed 8 months after I was. So we did all of this analysis. And one of the first things we realized when we were putting our strategic plan together for the city's response is the biggest place we can make an impact is if we work to institutionalize the city's response to trafficking. I just mentioned all those people, the 2 mayors, the 3 chiefs of staff, and the 3 chiefs of police. So institutionalization was incredibly important, right? Because if my position goes away, which it can, I'm not civil servant protected, what do we do to make sure this work is woven into the city's fabric? So we work to assess the opportunities with every single city department across our under the mayor's purview to see what they can do. And what we found is some city departments can do something very simple like recognize and report. So our health department, not our law enforcement, right, that's the traditional paradigm, is trained. All 1,200 employees are trained. Part of the health department is the food inspections, okay? It's actually under them by code instead of like police or something like that. And so basically our health department inspectors will go out and have a recognize and report function, and all of their forms and things like that sort of follow suit. Our health department also provides health services. So we've instituted screenings there where we have health professionals looking for victims of trafficking and then directing them to services rather than going this prosecutorial route or having to talk to law enforcement where there's a big fear. We've also engaged our procurement department at the City of Houston. And so we have, Mayor Turner signed an executive order that is a zero tolerance policy for all of our city's services and purchasing contracts for trafficking. And so that has sent a wave across the world because we were apparently the first municipality to do that. The federal government has a similar executive order. So we're using the different kinds of departments, and I can go on and on. We have several other departments that we've worked with. So that's what we meant by institutionalize the city's response. The other thing we saw when we did the landscape analysis was that there were a lot of good attempts at raising awareness at scale, but nonprofits are limited in their budgets, right? So they would take the free space that Clear Channel, the billboard company, offers, and that meant none of us were seeing those billboards, right? And if anyone's ever bought TV or radio time, it's very expensive. So this, exceeds their ability. So what we did is through the donor working group, the Freeze Foundation, I'm sure Nancy Freeze wouldn't mind me saying that, I haven't asked her, but she was a wonderful supporter. She paid for the whole media campaign, and as Rebecca mentioned, through one of their contacts, Deitzer did the whole campaign for free. So we're talking TV ads, radio ads, billboards. It was on all 950 of the city's metro buses, and it was before, during, and after the Super Bowl. So it was an 8-month-long campaign. And we generated 93 million impressions, and we increased, almost doubling calls to the national tip hotline from Houston. So that's an example of number two. The other thing we do is we use the mayor's office platform to have events every year. Our last event with Mayor Turner at the Hobby Center was called Conscientious Capitalism, Labor Trafficking and Mitigating Risk in Your Supply Chains, and it was for the corporate community. Again, this was a space that the traditional nonprofits weren't engaging the corporate community, and it was a gap that existed. And so we knew as the mayor's office, that's something we can do. So we'd done a year of corporate risk mitigation presentations individually at Apache, Weatherford, you name it, Exxon, Enbridge, that's now, and Statoil, which is now Equinor. And we had all of those corporate risk mitigation presentations around a labor trafficking lens with this post-disaster lens or framework that we're in now, lead into that Hobby Center event where we had all the corporate folks come out and listen to an esteemed group of panelists. Kyle was one of them, he was on that. So our third objective, what we found, is that we had an opportunity to coordinate services. Even though law enforcement and service providers had worked together since 2004, they weren't necessarily willing to take the referrals we were generating through our health department. I didn't mention this, but we also found gaps of psychological and medical services, systematic access to it, right? So we put a human trafficking psychology fellow through the Verizon Foundation at Ben Taub at Harris Health. And so for the first time, you had a psychologist screening for victims of trafficking in a psychologically unstable population. So probably the most vulnerable victims of trafficking. We were finding, and from the ones that we've worked with, the ones that come from Ben Taub are the hardest to work with because they have that psychologically unstable disposition. We also have a human trafficking hospital case manager that we placed there. So all of these places where we were starting to institute screenings and people were entrenched in sort of that traditional law enforcement approach, they weren't necessarily going to take our referrals, so now we needed our own city case managers. I'm not a social worker, that's not my area of expertise, so we joined forces with the Salvation Army, and their director of social services houses our case managers, but they also report to me at the city, so they're actually city employees. So we have the city case managers, the hospital workers that I explained, our health department folks screening, and that's a very new paradigm when we talk about systems change and making sure that this healthcare approach to finding victims of trafficking, and there was research that supported this approach, supports and complements the existing law enforcement approach. Emergency shelter was a gap. So that's something we worked out where no one that is a potential victim of trafficking is denied emergency shelter at the Salvation Army. So we pay the city, again, through another donor. Everything I'm talking about is donor funded. My budget at the city after my salary and benefits is about $50,000. So you can see that that's not covering any of the things I'm talking about. So a donor helped us pay and reserve these shelter beds because the teams that were doing outreach on the streets, the nonprofits that were doing outreach on the prostitution tracks, dangerous work, they didn't necessarily way back have the support of law enforcement. And so, but they were encountering people in crisis, right, that needed emergency shelter. And they would drive folks around 8 hours a night waiting for a shelter bed. And we thought, let us use our ability to bargain with the Salvation Army, our ability to raise funds, and do this for our partner nonprofits, even though they're small, even though they're new, even though they may be fledgling, because they're not going to stop doing the work. So those are some of the things we did. And you know, after 3 years and 7 months, my favorite objective to talk about now is our last one, which was to become a national and an international model. Because we were the first, we felt an awesome responsibility and burden to make sure we did it well, right? All eyes were on us. And if we failed, no other cities were going to take this up. And we clearly proved that there was tremendous opportunity within municipal government to do something outside of RPD, right? In addition to RPD. So for our fifth objective, we're at a point right now where the Jones Day Foundation has funded our 1010 municipal fellowships. One thing Mayor Turner and our Chief of Staff, Marvelette Hunter, have just, I mean, they're phenomenal across the board, but have been specifically phenomenal about is opening up the doors for the United States Conference of Mayors. So Mayor Turner and I have been there about 2 or 3 times, and we have pitched our plan to rooms full of mayors. We've pitched it and we've pitched it, and through a series of different steps that we took with them at the Executive Fall Leadership Meeting just in September, Mayor Turner, Chief Acevedo, and I announced our city's 1010 municipal fellowships. And the Jones Day Foundation basically offered to cover the air and hotel for senior staff for applicants from mayor's offices across the country to do a 2-day human trafficking immersion program with us leading it. So we were really excited about it. It had never been done before. We always got calls like, how come the city of Houston doesn't do a conference like, you know, is done by nonprofits in Chicago? Or how come we don't do this or that? This is our version of a conference. If there are conferences happening in Chicago and San Diego, go to Chicago and San Diego. That's not a gap, right? We can fill a gap where other cities don't have a place to go and sort of immerse themselves and learn the things we learned over a very long, it's short, but it felt very long, 3 years and 7 months. So the 1010 Muni Fellowships, we hosted our first pilot in January, like I said, at the Jones Day offices with the foundation's assistance. They paid for everything, and then they went even more, they gave us even more money than they said. And we hosted about 8 people from 7 cities, and it went really well. The feedback was great, and they have the goals of going back to their own cities and implementing at least 2 or 3 things, because they're not dedicated trafficking people, right? It's maybe the head of public safety for Mayor Garcetti's office in Los Angeles, and other folks. So now in March, we're getting ready to host our second session, and we have 16 people coming from 13 mayor's offices. And this one's, you know, we're glad we had the pilot run, because this one, the mayor will be there, the assistant secretary, who's a Trump appointee, for DHHS will be there. Bloomberg Associates, Mayor Bloomberg's pro bono venture, wants to come and observe for 3 days. And then Bloomberg Associates and I are working on doing an international session with some of their clients as well. So we're super excited that the kind of funding minds Molly and Kyle have, the very different kinds of ways that they work together to get the position established with a minimal investment compared to what it would have been had they taken a different route. I hope I'm not incorrect in saying that, Kyle, has yielded all of this kind of fruit.
That really is a perfect segue, because as we're recounting memories and stories of what's been built and changed, that really, this is not your traditional RFP grant proposal process, obviously. The donor working group truly has taken an adaptive approach. We're watching, you know, doing the landscape analysis, getting real-time feedback to figure out what solutions we need to pivot to then find the right resources and people to catalyze, you know, said action or said gap. So as Minal is telling, all of what has been built at the mayor's office and the evolution over these 3 years, it has been that constant feedback loop of iteration, try, find the right sources, make a connection, put it out there, see what happens, get that R&D back to then figure out what our next steps are. And Kyle, as you reflect on your journey with the things you know now, and thinking back to the beginning when you started and all the things you didn't know, what would you say has been a pivotal transformation point for Stardust's journey?
A number of things. I mean, it's such a complex issue. It's in this criminal framework is going to think of it as a crime. It's also obviously a moral issue. But for us, it was really understanding how integrated the issue is into our formal economy and how close we all are to this issue. And so there are dynamics of economics at play here, laws of supply and demand, but also the illicit massage business is a great example of how close where this trafficking is taking place, and it really opened our eyes as an example that this illegitimate business is a tenant essentially of a strip center that we may own. And there are 7,000 illicit massage businesses across the country. So starting to look at our own portfolio and understand what's our exposure to trafficking, which is a really weird question for us to kind of ask. Our family business, which we have sold, was also in retail, so understanding the global supply chain kind of very differently from that perspective and what the exposure is to this exploitation. And so we started really kind of thinking through ways, if we really are about impact on the human, kind of the humanity of this, and not just about generosity for our own sake, that we can do more. And so we started looking at my position, having one foot on the philanthropic side and another on the investment side, very clearly started connecting dots. And so we went, after a trip, for example, in Asia, another trip to Asia, we went back to our investment advisors and said, we'd like to have no exposure to human trafficking in our public equity portfolio, and got a lot of silence, and it took several months, but finally found a manager who is now working with MSCI to take controversy data related to trafficking and forced labor, child labor, building that into our their selection process and excluding companies. And there have been hundreds of companies that have public controversies related to this, and exclude them and blacklist them from our portfolio. They asked if they could open that up to their platform, and now it's the fastest growing exclusionary screen on their platform. And I think they have over 300 accounts now that are using this platform. So it started signaling to us that something was there. We integrated questions around supply chain and trafficking into our due diligence questionnaire on our private equity side, our direct and fund side. So understanding, from a risk and really, an investment analysis side of the exposure here, as there is serious reputational risk now and litigation risk. I think, on the litigation risk, I think it would be interesting to see who, for example, in the Kraft case, who owns the strip center. Because there's actually a civil statute that allows women, boys that are victim survivors to seek restitution and civil damages against anyone, any company that knew or should have known that exploitation was taking place and they benefited from it in their business. So I think you'll see this next phase will be who owns that, and you'll start seeing lawsuits flying there. So this is a real, reputational risk standpoint from an asset owner side. So we started kind of peeling the layer. And then finally, we recognized that as we talked to companies that said, okay, we understand the risk, we're all kind of complicit in this way, we want to do something, what do we do? The tools to deal with this in complex supply chains, for example, are extremely limited. You wouldn't believe how many firms still use Excel and audits to take care of complex, 3, 4, 5-tier supply chains. And so what we decided to do was use investment capital, came together with another major foundation in the country working on this, and created an early stage venture fund for profit, investing in emerging technologies to disrupt supply chain systems. So that's like blockchain, for example. We're invested in a blockchain company that is using a blockchain to trace goods, kind of a chain of custody thing. We're using mobile technology on factory floors that have real-time information up to the ultimate buyers like Walmart, which, by the way, came into fun with this along with Disney and some others, to show the buyers what's going on real-time right now in Indonesia because of the mobile phones that they have. And so this technology, AI, machine learning for risk audits for companies to see. So recognizing that we're using now the capital, we're moving on beyond kind of philanthropic engagement at this point and using the capital where it makes much more sense as a commercial tool to address this in these ways. So that's some of the work that we've done on the kind of the investment side as well.
Awesome. Well, in our last couple minutes before we go to questions, which I'm not sure, Siri, will you be bringing the questions up? Oh, they're right there. Great, thank you. Kind of final parting words. Minal, why don't you share a little bit about, just you mentioned the 1010 Municipal Fellows, but what's next on the horizon for the mayor's office? And Kyle, why don't you think about a parting remark of, if we could leave and do one thing, how should our minds and perspectives be shifted and an action we could take? So, Minal, do you want to?
Sure, I'll mention one more thing that I didn't mention that goes at how we're moving away from that existing law enforcement paradigm and doing things that supplement it, right, while it kind of stays in place. So we're working on a pre-book diversion program because prostitution is so sort of conflated with trafficking, and it makes it very hard for our police when they're out there doing their good work to distinguish. We're working on a pre-book diversion program. We're talking to some partners where our police, I know many of the families represented here are from Houston, but basically like our sobering center here, where someone's intoxicated, instead of going to jail, they go to services downtown. We're working on a pre-book diversion program where some of our police, we're gonna do it as a pilot, are taking folks that are coming in on these prostitution charges and taking them straight to services to see if the relationships that our case managers are able to build very quickly and the rapport they're able to establish is something that can help them versus incarceration. So we'll be looking at that over the next year or so and see if we make it, sort of a larger institutionalized program within HPD.
Yeah, I think my perspective, generally just beyond trafficking, I think we can all do a better job of evaluating the tools in our tool belt. And I think donors, especially donors with the liquidity of it, create a foundation and start down this road around kind of focusing on grant making and really are become a hammer looking for nails to hit when in fact maybe a wrench is a better tool to use. And I think, for us, that has meant looking at our other assets, both from leverage and social capital to the investment capital. For you, it may be something different on a different issue, or maybe it's trafficking, and maybe you're going to go back and reevaluate your lease agreements in your strip centers. I think that's where we've recognized that a family office is really we already have a number of tools, and so we happen to be focused on this issue right now, but as that changes, which I think it will over time, making sure that we understand what's the best tool for the need that's in our community.
Great. Well, I think in our last few minutes, we might be able to get to all four of these questions. So for the panelists, there's one about prevalence and scope locally. So the question is, what is the scope, the size of the issue here in Houston, and how many folks are impacted? And I'll tie that with the question about data. Is there any reliable local, regional, or national data telling us the trends, basically, if human trafficking is trending up and down, and how we measure that? So we'll take those chunks first.
So this is my favorite question to get. So there are no prevalence and scope studies for the city of Houston. I think there are few for the agricultural fields in California, maybe Florida, but there's no prevalence in scope studies. So the hub language is something that we struggle with, okay, because it's said often, we are the 4th largest city in the United States. Urban centers are going to deal with all kinds of crime, just like New York City, Los Angeles. But you may have heard that we're the hub across the country. You may have heard that we're the #1 human trafficking spot in the world. I've heard that one. Anyone heard that one? I'm not sure how they know that. How have they done a worldwide prevalence or scope study, right? I'm of Indian heritage. Are you telling me that it's more than the densely populated streets where the brothels are in Calcutta, New Delhi, and Bombay? You know, I just have a hard time believing that. So I would encourage everyone to be active listeners, and I think the persons that ask these questions are. So there's no prevalence or scope study. Here's why. One of the first things we looked at is doing one, because we wanted to see the impact all of our programs would have, and we wanted that baseline. So we contacted a researcher at Harvard Kennedy School, who does these independently, because universities won't approve these kinds of studies because there's risk to the researchers and risks to the potential victims of trafficking, right? So he does them independently, and because of that, it's incredibly expensive. So I told you my budget was $50,000. For a baseline study, he charged about $2 million. Okay, so we didn't have that money. I also had 6 months to do some concrete things to make sure Mayor Turner would make the decision to keep me, right? And going to Mayor Turner and saying, we're in the process of doing a 2-year-long prevalence study meant I was going to be jobless. I can almost guarantee that, because he's a very concrete kind of guy. Okay, so I was like, this is not going to work. We don't have the money, and this is not going to work. We didn't have the donor relationships yet either, right? And then we needed him again, right? So after we do all of our programs, we needed to come back, and that would be another $2 million, so we could see what the impact was. So those don't actually exist. As far as regional studies, there is a UT study that gets cited often where they've projected about 379,000, about that many victims of trafficking across the state of Texas. I think you need to examine the methodology. I mean, they make good projections, it's used widely, but sometimes we use things because it's the best we've got. And so that's that question. For our programs, we measure each one of our programs in a different way, in a very kind of tailored way. So that's how we decide internally, do we continue this? Is it making enough of a difference, however we define that? If there's something that's very low impact for us to do and it makes no difference, but we don't know if it's making a difference, so if we give out 1,000 cards at these illicit massage establishments when our HPD goes in to do their canvasses and we don't know if the tip hotline got a call, I mean, that's a very low impact thing for us to do. We're going to continue to do it even though we're not seeing an increase in calls, maybe. Does that answer?
I had two points really quick. So on the prevalence study, it's really expensive because trafficking victims, survivors don't self-identify as I'm trafficking. Mm-hmm. And so there's really getting into communities and understanding, spots of vulnerability, and it's a very complex issue to get to reliable information. That said, one of the better things we do have is also the hotline data, the National Trafficking Hotline data. And we receive roughly, we're the second or third first amount of calls in our community to the hotline across the country. But is that we have better awareness because we've been working on, roughly only 5 to 7% of people know the hotline even exists across the country. Is that because we're better here at, pasting the hotline all over the place? So there's a question there, but we do know there are thousands of calls going into the hotline from Harris County, Houston every year.
And the other thing is you could do some simple math. When I started, we had 289 illicit massage parlors advertising sex for sale. With all of the work we've done in canvases from HPD from a regulatory perspective, where it shifts the burden on the victim, where it's a prostitution bust, you might have a potential victim getting arrested. This is a regulatory thing. So they go out and ticket the owners and the managers of the brothels. So that's another kind of shift that we've effectuated with our HPD. Now, if we look at the numbers now, we've lowered them to about 228, and we're going to continue these canvases because it looks like they're working. Right? At the end of the day, it's about demand, and so if there's a market for it, there's not a thing the city is going to be able to do to put a complete stop to illicit massage parlors, right? And so when we get into the morality of purchasing sex, that's where it's, not a conversation for us, but places of worship and family dinner tables and culture and things like that. But with 228 of them, let's say there's 3 victims in each parlor, right? I mean, already we're near 1,000, right? And that doesn't include all of the 25 other industries that Polaris identified. So do we have a problem here? Absolutely. Are we exceeding Los Angeles or New York? I don't know. Do we have the highest number of calls? Absolutely. But we've also done a great deal of, to raise awareness. So.
I know we're going to move to the next question,
Yeah.
but just one last point on that.
Okay.
So there was a study done a couple of years ago on the demand side of commercial sex and massage establishments, and they chose Houston because of our number, and you quoted the number of establishments, but the study also found that there were 2,800 transactions a day in Houston at these establishments, which equated to $100 million in revenue in one city in 1 year. This study was very sophisticated. They set up, cameras, counted, watched. It was a huge study. So until that demand goes away, and people say the supply is the vulnerability, we know we have plenty of vulnerability. Where you find vulnerability, you find trafficking. That's an example of data that we do have, and I think for us that was just mind blowing when we learned how prevalent that is.
So with that, one of the next questions is, are there lessons to be learned from successes and failures in other metro areas? And
So we just had that 1010 fellowship, and one of the things that was striking was that a lot of the cities do have some level of response, maybe not the smaller ones. I think when we did the municipal fishbowl, where each of the cities had to get up and say what they were going to go back and take on in their cities, the city's executive order on procurement was what every single city there picked. We were stunned, and we'd already gotten a great deal of attention for it. Bloomberg Law had done an article that they published on it, all kinds of things. So that was surprising to us. Also, Los Angeles has had a good, long-standing response to that, and they had actually done an RFP for a nonprofit to help shelter. They have a much bigger budget than we do. So that was something, they had taken on the sheltering of victims in a completely, totally different way, which was very interesting to us. So I think that's something that we learned. There's also great things that law enforcement do across the country, but our HPD does a great job combating trafficking all the time as well.
do you want to mention Feast Network?
Yeah, there was a network. It's kind of a bit dormant, but across a funder funded about 10 cities working with nonprofit leadership in each city focused on demand reduction. And so sharing, these 10 cities came together to share tactics and strategies for, especially when Backpage was around and kind of the leading way to transact business in the trafficking industry, online ads, to really share best practices as it relates to kind of false ads that lead to information about getting help or helping law enforcement address demand and cutting that down. And I think that really led to law enforcement connecting across different cities and sharing best practices, as well as funders and what other funders are doing and how they're thinking about these things.
Perfect. So in our last 4 minutes or so, question on budget. You mentioned some of that earlier, Minal and Kyle, you can speak for the donor working group. So our collective budget over the years for these efforts and the successes that they've brought forth. And then on the continuum, right, prevention. If we can have robust prevention, obviously we'll need less budget funds over the years, but budget and prevention are the last 2 questions.
Okay, so for the city of Houston, I mentioned that we have the $50,000 after my salary and benefits, but we've raised $1.6 million, and most of that money is coming in the last year and a half, because the first year and a half we were really doing the assessing and focusing on a few big wins to sort of survive the transition. I hope Mayor Turner doesn't see this tape, but that's what I was focusing on to make sure that we can continue the work. So it's $1.6 million from a variety of funds. The city has a little bit of that $250,000 or so that they contribute to that 1.6 million. And that's what we've used to fund everything. I mean, I think we mentioned the media campaign that we've done, the shelter relationship is donor funded, really everything we do, the 1010 municipal fellowships, the international municipal fellowships we're gonna do are gonna be donor funded. So everything we do, the hospital healthcare case manager, our city case managers, all of these are donor funded. My staff analyst, when I finally got some support, he basically doubled the capacity of our office, right? So we started to move at a much faster pace. His salary is donor funded. It's the Houston Endowment that's funded him for 4 years. And so all of my team of 5, well, 4 of the 5 of us are donor funded. Is that what you think they were asking? Yeah, okay.
And how about from our donor perspective? It's been scrappy, is
Yeah,
what I'd
it's
say.
hard to know. It's really hard to know exactly. I think we know that foundations weren't really prioritizing the issue, and there was probably, based on the nonprofits that existed here that were focused on trafficking, several $100,000 a year. I think now collectively we do close to a few $1 million a year in funding the local nonprofits, the city effort, and so I mean definitely a shift there.
Yeah, I'd say we're really looking for those leveraged opportunities. So whenever our group identifies a new gap or something that we want to go after, we're immediately asking ourselves, how do we level up? Because we're only going to have just a little bit to bring to the table. So we need to find a way where that little bit can be amplified. And so we kind of use that as our recipe of what's the need, who's the best person to provide or advise in this situation, what can we contribute that can be catalytic for an outsized result. So that's kind of our methodology. And closing up with prevention, what are best proven methods for prevention? Getting this is really the heart of our donor working group too. We started with only having the goal of only seeking upstream solutions that got at root causes, which that's essentially what this question about prevention drives, get at the root.
So I think prevention is by nature hard to measure because you've prevented something. So it's very hard for us. So we'll do things not, because it's a good idea and it's the moral right thing to do, like the mayor's executive order for our supply chains. Now, looking at what kind of trafficking that's actually prevented, we will never really be able to tell you because the goal is to have prevented it. What we can say is we love the executive order because it's been a perfect example for our corporate community to follow when we go out and speak to them. So there's things like that happen. So prevention for us is very difficult to mention. There are some great nonprofits here in Houston that focus on prevention. And it would be interesting to get their perspective. You're on the board of Children at Risk, right, Rebecca? And how they might look at it might be interesting. For us, it's a little bit difficult.
Yeah, and I think, ultimately, these problems are not going to be solved until the demand goes away. And so on the corporate supply chain side, for example, there's a demand for cheap goods and services, drives cheap labor. But there is also, within that framework, most of the trafficking takes place on the corporate side and supply chains through, at subcontracting level with recruiters that are unethical. And so what companies are starting to do is really making sure that it's called the No Fees Initiative, that no employee ever pays a fee to get a job anywhere in their supply chain. And so you're seeing all these companies move to making sure that none of their suppliers, none of their subcontractors are using brokers that are being paid by the employee. And just recently, a major company just reimbursed $2 million worth of fees to employees that were essentially bonded labor. And so that is prevention, and that is sending waves deep into the trafficking networks globally.
So we thank you for your time. We hope we've shared some things that you didn't know about trafficking.